यहाँ आपको बता दें कि जो सीए के डॉक्टर वी अनंथा नागेश्वरन हैं, वो एक प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस को एड्रेस करने जा रहे हैं। इकोनॉमिक सर्वे का जो है इसका प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस ये यहाँ शुरू हुआ है।
So we just spent 1 month of 2023, so you still have 11 more months to go. So I wish you all a very happy and healthy rest of 2023. This morning, we had the International Monetary Fund release its World Economic Outlook update. And they maintained India's GDP forecast or estimate for current financial year at 6.8, next financial year at 6.1, and importantly, for 24-25, they kept India's real GDP growth forecast at 6.8%. So they show an acceleration of India's GDP after a slight dip which they estimate for the next financial year. In fact, the presentation today is going to focus on this aspect, that India's GDP growth is poised to do better in the remainder of this decade, and that is the focus of this economic survey itself. Okay. Not moving.
यार आपको वहाँ रहने दीजिए ना, वहाँ बैठ गए।
Frozen? Okay. Sir, हो गया यहाँ से Okay. We basically let you admire the cover slide for a bit longer than it needed to be. So, what are the key messages, as I mentioned in the initial remarks? Why is the economic growth going to perform better this decade, remainder of the decade? And what the reforms of the last 8 years have done to make sure that happens? And beyond 2030, what will be India's medium-term growth magnets? And finally, as we look ahead to 2047, what else and what more we could do to realize India's full potential in the Amrit Kaal? And if you look at the, is it moving properly on the screens? Okay, thank you. The survey looks ahead to the medium term because the pandemic response and recovery phase is over. In fact, chapter 1, the title itself says, State of the Economy, Recovery Complete. And therefore, after a long time, we have banking, non-banking and corporate sectors with healthy balance sheets, and they are ready to borrow and lend and invest. So we don't have to speak about pandemic recovery anymore. We have to look ahead to the next phase of India's economic growth process. So why is economic growth going to be better this decade? In order to look ahead to the future, we always have to first look back at the rearview mirror. Let's rewind the tape a little bit. What happened in the first decade of the millennium was a lot of optimism about BRICS economies. By 2002, balance sheets were lean and mean. Companies were willing to borrow, invest, banks were willing to lend. So leverage ratio in the corporate sector and in the overall non-financial private sector rose very sharply in the first decade. And it got to the point where the credit to GDP ratio in actual terms was much higher than the trend in the first decade of the millennium. That is what you see. The middle hump is basically actual credit GDP ratio was well above trend, and it persisted for a long time. And because it was quite well above trend, and also the actual credit GDP ratio was well in excess lending, and the second decade was a payback time. So India went through a classic financial cycle, credit boom and credit bust. And this is not something new for the world. Every time you go through a financial boom and bust, it does leave its impact on economic growth, and that is what happened to us, especially in the second half of last decade. And you can see this here. Look at this chart. From 1980 to 2000, the bank credit to GDP ratio was roughly around between 25 and 30%. And then it jumped from 25 to 55, 60%, and spent the second decade of this millennium hovering in that range. This is the digestion process. So there was massive expansion. Remember, this is a ratio. GDP went up, but the bank credit expanded even more than GDP growth, and naturally, such a big spike within a space of 10 years, what we could not achieve in the previous 20 years, naturally had to lead to some kind of a credit indigestion problem, which had to be adjusted in the second decade. And now, that process of indigestion that has been sorted out, and the balance sheets are repaired now, and banks' non-performing ratio, whether it is scheduled commercial banks in general or public sector banks, they are lower now. And you can see that also banks have done so partly through recapitalization, raising fresh equity, and also through higher provisioning. So bank balance sheets are repaired, and that is why you see that in the credit growth picking up. You look at credit growth across sectors, agriculture, industry, services and personal sector, housing loans and car loans, etc. The growth rate is now sustainably above double digits. And this is a sign that this is what we were missing towards the second half of last decade because of balance sheet issues. So to quickly summarize exactly what happened was 2005 to 12, credit boom that led to balance sheet stress later, phase of a higher non-performing assets due to past forbearance. And then, by the time we could repair, just want to leave one statistic with you. The non-financial private sector leverage ratio, debt to GDP, went up by 40 percentage points in the first decade, from 2000 to 2010. And from 2010 to 2018, it came down by 30 percentage points. And by 2018, that was kind of done, it had bottomed out. But before we could start expecting corporates to borrow and banks to lend, came the collapse of IL&FS and some housing finance companies. And by the time we got a grip on that problem, came the pandemic. That lasted 2 years. And then 2022, we had the commodity price shock and synchronized monetary policy tightening after a very long time in the developed world. So it's a case of balance sheet stress followed by successive one-off exogenous or external shocks that have basically prevented the impact of economic reforms pursued by the government on economic growth. We would have seen the results already, but for these successive one-off shocks on the back of a fairly large credit boom that turned into a bust. The reforms of the last 8 years, which I just now mentioned to you, basically spans multiple dimensions. It is not purely about economic reforms for higher growth. It is also about inclusive growth, financial inclusion, banking cleanup, the creation of the digital public infrastructure, which I think I'm going to talk about a bit later as well, and contribution to healthy India, ease of living, and continuing on to the next slide, physical infrastructure creation, facilitating investments, transparent taxes and tax administration, ease of doing business, and farmers' welfare. So broadly speaking, about 10 areas we have covered here. These reforms were happening even as the banking cleanup was going on. And this episode between 2014 and 2022 has a lot of parallel to what happened between 98 and 2002 as well. Then, as now, the banking system was coming out of an NPA crisis, and there were sanctions on India after the nuclear device was tested in Pokhran in 98, and deleveraging was getting on in the banking and corporate sector. There were 2 successive droughts. The technology boom ended, internet boom ended in 1999-2000, and the US recession followed. 9/11 happened. But amidst all these shocks, Interest rates were deregulated. Privatization was pursued vigorously. And the first foundations of the insolvency and bankruptcy regime was laid with the asset recovery mechanisms. The FRBM Act was introduced. And today's digital infrastructure, which we talk about, the foundation for that was laid with telecom reforms in that era. But obviously, there is a lagged effect for these reforms to show through in the data because underlying conditions had to turn favorable. Because of India's growth dynamics and the cost of capital being lower than the nominal GDP growth, there is enough scope for the fiscal parameters to improve in the coming years once we achieve sustained and steady growth as we expect. And that you will see in Chapter 3 on the fiscal side. Creating public goods for inclusive growth, that is the third pillar. And it is not only about physical infrastructure, although it is an important part of it, in terms of the amount of kilometers of highways completed, electricity installed capacity. This is RBI showing that in 2011, if you put them as an index value of 100, where they stand today in 2020, excepting the case of railway track, which because much of it was laid already, and therefore even a 14% improvement in 9 years in terms of 8,000 kilometers added is a very big number. But in every other case, national highways or cargo handling capacity, the growth rate is 80% or doubled in the last 10 years or so. And on the softer policy side, apart from physical milestones, you have public-private partnerships, the national infrastructure pipeline, the national monetization pipeline, which will improve economic efficiency, as I mentioned earlier, and the PM Gati Shakti, which is still in its early years. The underlying purpose of it is to make sure that public investment projects get completed without cost and time overruns, and there is synergy between various departments such a way that sequencing happens naturally and logically, and therefore delays are minimized. So PM Gati Shakti is about reducing information asymmetries and making sure that government projects are executed on time and within cost estimates. The national logistics policy is an important cog in the wheel. Our export competitiveness is hampered by the fact that logistics costs constitute 14 to 15%. The goal is to halve it and bring it down to international levels, and this national logistics policy will play a very important part in that. The public digital infrastructure, about which now there is a lot of justified optimism on India, not only in the country but outside as well. The initial phase of reforms started with the identity and then the Jan Dhan Yojana, financial inclusion, Aadhaar and mobile. And then it moved on to unified payment interface, which allows even payment as small as 2 rupees through a barcode. Common service centers for IT-enabled services. PM Disha, digital DigiLocker, BharatNet and services at a click. Now, they have set the stage for new age reforms, which is now going to make sure that hitherto neglected segments of society, low-income households and micro businesses, get a fair shot at accessing national and international markets and getting funded by financial institutions. These digital developments allow all of them to leave their digital footprint, which creates a credit history for them, so that they are able to access finance as well as access markets. And that is the potential of digital infrastructure. Even though it's almost 5-6 years old since the beginning, formal study of how much digital infrastructure contributes to growth is yet to be undertaken. But it is my belief that India's improved balance sheets and the digital infrastructure together will add anywhere between 60 to 100 basis points to India's potential GDP growth, which is what we were missing in the course of the second decade. This is an elevation and enhancement in India's potential GDP growth because the baseline is assumed to be around 6% by many international organizations. But what is important is we have a financial cycle that was disrupted in the second decade. That is coming back. And we have the new development, public digital infrastructure, that is adding another 30 to 50 basis points. So together, these two developments add about 50 to 100 basis points to the trend growth which many organizations pegged for India at 6%. And that is why my optimism is that in the coming decade, rest of the decade, the potential GDP growth, without taking into account export potential, because the global economy is still rife with uncertainty, the growth rate could be around 6.5% to 7% rather than between 6 and 6.5%. Ultimately, economic growth is only a means to an end. And what is that end? The end is prosperous and dignified living for citizens. And therefore, basically, the chapter on the social sector, in a departure from the previous economic surveys, we have actually brought it to the front of the economic survey. After the initial state of the economy, medium-term outlook, fiscal and monetary affairs, inflation, the sixth chapter in the survey is on social sector, and perhaps it is the longest and the biggest chapter in the entire economic survey this year. And there is a reason for it, both in terms of its placement and its size, because the interventions made by the government have been substantial, and it is to make sure that no one is left behind. This is about inclusive policy towards public sector enterprises, hoping to retain its presence only in core sectors and exiting non-core sectors. Foreign investment licensing norms have been liberalized. There is automatic route for more sectors now, 100% automatic FDI, and there is a single window facilitation portal. The outcome of which is seen in the actual gross FDI inflows, the blue line shows you. As a percentage of GDP as well, it has gone up from 2.2% to 2.6% of GDP. And ultimately, the various investments, whether it is domestic or foreign, have to translate into employment. Urban unemployment ratio has come down during the pandemic peak of around 20% down to 7%. And the worker population ratio has picked up from a low of around 35% back to around 45%. EPFO payroll data, which tracks new workers joining the scheme with salaries of 15,000 or below, in 22-23, their levels are running well above the previous 3 years. And in terms of the facilitation of employment, the eShram portal provides a bridge between employers and informal workers, and the National Career Service has registered 2.8 crore job seekers and 6.8 lakh employers as well. So what is going to happen is that as the private sector investment begins to kick in, and as the construction sector comes back to life with rural migrants getting back to their urban employment opportunities, the employment scenario will pick up as it did in the first decade as well. In the first decade, the capital expenditure resulted in employment generation, and that is a phase that India is looking ahead to in the coming years as well. Micro and small businesses, we all know that India has a preponderance of micro businesses, but the recent changes in changing the threshold and also adding a new criteria turnover apart from investment, and more importantly the provision of emergency credit line guarantee scheme during the pandemic, have enabled that this sector remains in good health. And the evidence of it is what we see. GST paid by micro, small and medium enterprises didn't really flag or slacken in the pandemic year. They kept up. If anything, they registered gradual increases from 18-19 all the way to 21-22 as well. Energy transition. This is both a matter of security, energy security, as well as ensuring that India deals with climate change. India is well ahead of its target for renewable energy mix in the overall energy mix balance. And we have 8 missions now addressing climate concerns. We updated our nationally defined contributions in COP27, and there is a national green hydrogen mission launched. And the sovereign green bond, the first tranche of $1 billion was just auctioned. We got a better yield. They were able to sell the green bond at a 6 basis point lower than the conventional sovereign borrowing cost. and there will be one more coming in the current financial year. All these issues are covered apart from the global dynamics of climate change, etc., in the chapter on climate and environment. Of course, for most of you, while the medium-term picture is important, for some of you, obviously, what is interesting and what is exciting from the point of view of near-term attention is what is the growth rate that the survey projects for the next financial year. So we are now, after having discussed the medium-term prospects, which are now looking good because cleaned up balance sheets and reforms are going to have a lagged payback, where we are today is that the numbers which we have up to the end of second quarter in September, July to September, the momentum is continuing in the economy. If you look at the industrial production, consumer durables, infrastructure and construction goods and manufacturing, they are running at a rate better than they were in the previous 2 years. And the middle portion is very important. 10 out of 10 sectors in the private listed company space, all these sectors, investments undertaken by companies in the first half of 22-23 is higher than what it was in the first half of FY 21-22. On the right side, what you see is a proxy for contact-based services, leisure, tourism, hospitality, domestic and foreign travel. All of them we are trying to proxy with this one number, showing that by and large, air passenger and cargo traffic are now running at more than 90% of the pre-pandemic levels. And as I mentioned earlier, credit growth is picking up across different sectors, MSMEs, large industry, services, and non-food credit. All of them are growing at more than double-digit rates. And even NBFCs, as you can see on the right side, their credit disbursal is also rising. And in general, credit to MSMEs is now on an average has grown at around 30% since January 2022. And not only the banking system, but also the non-banking financial corporations, their non-performing assets are lower than they were 15 months ago or 18 months ago. Therefore, the survey projects the economic growth rate to be 6.5% for the next financial year, and the range we have projected for the outcomes is between 6 and 6.8%. Baseline is 6.5, the range is 6 to 6.8. Some of you might think the range is asymmetric in nature, and it is deliberate. Because we do understand that the global political and economic environment remains still rife with uncertainty. We have many known unknowns as well as unknown unknowns, and we also do not know how the speed with which global economy recovers will lead to the kind of inflation pressures that we saw last year. China reopened fairly rapidly, and as of now, the United States economy looks set.
कई सारे मुद्दे हैं जो इकोनॉमिक सर्वे है उसमें है कि 2023-24 में 6.5% विकास दर का अनुमान है। यह भी दावा किया गया कि कोरोना से हुए नुकसान से उबर चुकी है अब हमारी अर्थव्यवस्था। मौजूदा वित्त वर्ष में विकास दर 7% रहने का अनुमान है। भारत सबसे तेजी से बढ़ती अर्थव्यवस्था बना रहेगा, यह अनुमान लगाया गया है। 2023-24 में जीडीपी ग्रोथ 6 से 6.8% रहने का अनुमान है। ई कॉमर्स में विकास दर 18% काफी बेहतर रहेगा, ऐसा अनुमान है। कृषि क्षेत्र में निवेश 9.3% तक पहुंच गया है। 8 सालों में हुए सुधार आर्थिक विकास के आधार बने हैं।